the Venezuela turning point no one can ignore. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not because it was the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in Venezuela's presidential election, but because of what happened in the 72 hours that followed. That was the moment when the tectonic plates of global power shifted beneath our feet, and almost no one noticed. Not in the way they should have, at least. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. And what unfolded in Caracas last summer wasn't just another election in a troubled Latin American nation. It was the first real test of whether the United States still has the capacity or the will to enforce its vision of global order in its own backyard. The results were revealing. And they should terrify anyone who believes in the durability of the post-Cold War order. Here's what you were: Maduro stole the election. The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, won in a landslide. The United States, along with 50 other nations, refused to recognize the results. Sanctions were tightened. Diplomatic pressure mounted. The narrative was clean, moral, and reassuringly familiar, another chapter in the long struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, with Washington on the right side of history. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not that it's entirely false. It's that it's dangerously incomplete. The official story relies on a few key pillars. First, the opposition's claim that they won 70% of the vote, based on exit polls and tally sheets from a sample of voting centers. Second, the Carter Center's preliminary report, which stated that the election did not meet international standards of electoral integrity. Third, the near-unanimous condemnation from the U.S. and its allies, who swiftly recognized Gonzalez as the legitimate president. And fourth, the dramatic images of protests in Caracas, where Venezuelans took to the streets to demand Maduro's ouster. On the surface, it all fits. Venezuela is a failed state. Its economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. 7 million people have fled the country. Maduro's regime is corrupt, repressive, and increasingly isolated. If ever there was a moment for a democratic uprising to succeed, this should have been it. But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. Let's start with the election results. The opposition's claim of a 70% landslide is based on a partial sample of voting tallies, about 80% of the total. That's not nothing, but it's also not the full picture. The remaining 20% of votes, which the opposition didn't have access to, were overwhelmingly from rural areas and government strongholds. When the National Electoral Council announced the official results, Maduro with 51%, Gonzalez with 44%, the opposition cried fraud. But here's the CNE's results weren't just pulled out of thin air. They were based on the same tally sheets the opposition had, plus the missing 20%. And while the CNE is far from an impartial body, it's not clear that the opposition sample was representative enough to justify their claim of a landslide. Then there's the Carter Center report. Yes, it criticized the election for lacking transparency. But it also didn't endorse the opposition's victory claim. In fact, it explicitly stated that it couldn't verify the results because it wasn't granted full access to the vote counting process. That's a far cry from declaring the election stolen. And what about the protests? They were real, and they were met with brutal repression. But they also didn't come close to the scale of the 2017 protests, which at their peak drew hundreds of thousands into the streets. This time, the opposition struggled to maintain momentum. Why? Because after years of failed coups, economic collapse, and U.S. sanctions, many Venezuelans have simply given up. They're exhausted. And exhaustion doesn't fuel revolutions. So if the election wasn't the clear-cut fraud the West claims, what's really going on here? Let me tell you what the mainstream media isn't. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of an era. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. It's also a key node in the global gold trade, a critical supplier of coltan, and a strategic gateway to the Caribbean. For decades, the United States treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will to install friendly governments. But that era is over. And Venezuela is the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its will or whether it's now just another player in a multipolar world. Here's the hidden geopolitical: the United States is no longer the sole superpower. Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades systematically undermining American dominance, and Venezuela is one of their most important footholds. Moscow has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, providing loans, military equipment, and political cover. Beijing has done the same, turning Venezuela into a key supplier of oil and minerals for its industrial machine. Both countries see Venezuela as a critical ally in their broader strategy to erode U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. And here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. response to Maduro's re-election wasn't just about democracy. It was about resources. Venezuela's oil is the last major untapped reserve in the world that the U.S. doesn't control. And with global energy markets tightening, Washington can't afford to let it fall into the hands of its rivals. But the U.S. is no longer in a position to dictate terms. The sanctions regime, which has been in place since 2017, has failed to topple Maduro. If anything, it's made him more dependent on Russia and China. The opposition, meanwhile, is fractured and discredited after years of failed insurrections. And the Venezuelan military, which holds the real power in the country, has no incentive to abandon Maduro, especially when the alternative is a US-backed government that would likely purge them. So what's really happening here? The United States is trying to reassert control over a country it lost influence over years ago. And it's doing so at a moment when its global power is in decline. Let me put this in broader geopolitical context: the world is no longer unipolar. The US is still the strongest military power, but its economic and diplomatic leverage is waning. China is the world's largest trading nation. Russia, despite its setbacks in Ukraine, remains a nuclear superpower with the ability to project power globally. And the global south, countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, are increasingly asserting their independence from Western dominance. Venezuela is a microcosm of this shift. The US sees it as a rogue state that must be brought to heel. Russia and China see it as a strategic partner that must be protected. And the rest of the world? They're hedging their bets. Even U.S. allies like Colombia and Brazil have refused to recognize González as president, instead calling for negotiations. That's not because they love Maduro. It's because they recognize that the era of U.S. unilateralism is over. Now, let me be: I'm not defending Maduro. His regime is authoritarian, corrupt, and responsible for one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. But geopolitics isn't about morality. It's about power. And the power dynamics in Venezuela have fundamentally changed. The US is no longer dealing with a weak, isolated regime. It's dealing with a government that has the backing of 2 nuclear-armed great powers. And that changes everything. Let's talk about the military dimension. The US has a long history of intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the overthrow of Allende in Chile to the invasion of AMA. But those were different times. Today, Russia has a military presence in Venezuela, including advanced S-300 air defense systems and Wagner Group mercenaries. China has intelligence assets and economic leverage. And Venezuela itself has a battle-hardened military that's been fighting insurgencies for years. Any U.S. military action, whether a limited strike, a no-fly zone, or a full-scale invasion, would be far more complicated than the hawks in Washington want to admit. The U.S. could probably take Caracas in a matter of days. But holding it? That's another story. Iraq and Afghanistan taught us that regime change is the easy part. Nation building is the hard part. And Venezuela, with its hyperpolarized society and collapsed economy, would be a nightmare to stabilize. Then there's the risk of escalation. Russia has already warned that any U.S. military action in Venezuela would be met with a response. What does that mean? Cyber attacks? Arms shipments to anti-U.S. groups in Latin America? A naval blockade in the Caribbean? We don't know. But we do know that the U.S. is already stretched thin, supporting Ukraine, deterring China in the Pacific, and managing crises in the Middle East. Opening a third front in Venezuela would be reckless. And let's not forget the domestic political dimension. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy isn't just about geopolitics. It's also about Florida. Venezuela's diaspora, over 1 million strong, is a powerful voting bloc in a swing state. The administration's tough stance on Maduro is partly about shoring up support among Venezuelan Americans, who overwhelmingly oppose the regime. But it's also about sending a message to the broader Latino that Biden is tough on dictators. The problem? This kind of short-term political calculus often leads to long-term strategic blunders. The U.S. has a habit of prioritizing domestic politics over foreign policy, and Venezuela is no exception. The administration's refusal to negotiate with Maduro, even when it was clear that the opposition couldn't win, was a mistake. And now, with the election over and Maduro still in power, the U.S. is left with few good options. So where do we go from here? Let's look at the scenarios. Scenario: the best case. The U.S. and its allies double down on sanctions, hoping to strangle Maduro's regime economically. Russia and China, facing their own economic challenges, reduce their support. The Venezuelan military, seeing the writing on the wall, stages a coup and installs a transitional government. The U.S. lifts sanctions, oil flows to the west, and Venezuela begins a slow recovery. This is the scenario the Biden administration is hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Russia and China have too much invested in Venezuela to abandon it. And the Venezuelan military has no reason to turn on Maduro, especially when the alternative is a US-backed government that would likely prosecute them for human rights abuses. Scenario: the most likely. Maduro survives. The US and its allies maintain sanctions, but Russia and China step in to fill the gap. Venezuela's economy stabilizes at a low level, with just enough oil revenue to keep the regime afloat. The opposition fractures, with some leaders going into exile and others cutting deals with Maduro. The U.S. is forced to accept a negotiated settlement, one that leaves Maduro in power but grants some concessions to the opposition. This is the scenario that's already playing out. The U.S. has signaled that it's open to talks, but only if Maduro makes significant concessions like releasing political prisoners and allowing free elections. Maduro, for his part, has shown no interest in stepping down. The result? A stalemate. Venezuela remains a failed state, but one that's increasingly integrated into the Russian-Chinese sphere of influence. Scenario: the worst case. The U.S. decides to escalate. It imposes a naval blockade to prevent Russian and Chinese oil shipments. Maduro responds by nationalizing U.S. assets in Venezuela. Russia sends more military advisors. China threatens to dump U.S. Treasury bonds. The situation spirals into a full-blown crisis, with the risk of direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. The U.S. has a long history of miscalculating in Latin America. And with tensions already high over Ukraine and Taiwan, the risk of a Venezuela crisis spinning out of control is real. Now, let me step back and offer some broader perspective. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. That it can promote democracy, enforce human rights, and maintain global dominance all at the same time. But that era is ending. The U.S. is trying to hold on to a unipolar world that no longer exists. And in doing so, it's making the same mistakes that empires have made throughout: overreach, hubris, and a refusal to adapt to changing realities. Let me be: the U.S. cannot afford to fight a three-front war against Russia in Ukraine, against China in the Pacific, and against Iran in the Middle East, while also trying to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela. It's not sustainable. And yet, that's exactly what the foreign policy establishment is pushing for. So what should we do instead? First, the U.S. needs to accept that it no longer has the power to dictate outcomes in Latin America. That doesn't mean abandoning the region. It means engaging with it on more equal terms. That starts with diplomacy. The U.S. should offer Maduro a sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment to economic reform. It's not ideal. But it's better than the alternative. Second, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a geopolitical battleground. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The region is no longer America's backyard. It's a collection of sovereign nations with their own interests. The US should focus on trade, investment, and cooperation, not regime change. Third, the US needs to recognize that Russia and China are here to stay. They're not going to abandon Venezuela. The best the US can do is compete by offering better economic deals, more stable partnerships, and a vision of the future that doesn't involve endless sanctions and isolation. This is controversial, I know. The foreign policy establishment will call it appeasement. The hawks will say it's surrender. But I've studied this for decades. And I can tell you the alternative: endless confrontation, escalating crises, and the risk of war is far worse. Let me leave you with the Venezuela crisis as a turning point. It's the moment when the world finally woke up to the fact that the US is no longer the sole superpower. And how the US responds will determine whether this transition is peaceful or whether it leads to a new era of conflict. The choice is ours. But we have to be honest about the stakes. And we have to be willing to accept that the world has changed and that America's place in it is no longer what it once was. The question: are we ready to face that reality? Or will we keep pretending that the old rules still apply? The answer will shape the next century of global politics. And Venezuela is just the beginning. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a political or economic crisis, it's a military one. And the way this plays out could redefine the security architecture of the Western Hemisphere for decades. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines about sanctions and elections. First, there's the Russian footprint. Moscow hasn't just sent Wagner Group mercenaries to prop up Maduro, though they've done that, too. Since 2019, Russia has deployed long-range bombers to Venezuela, conducted joint naval exercises in the Caribbean, and even stationed S-300 air defense systems on Venezuelan soil. In December 2022, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed at Maiquetía International Airport, just 1,500 miles from Florida. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's a demonstration of power projection, a message to Washington that Moscow can operate in America's traditional sphere of influence with impunity. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia isn't in Venezuela because it loves Maduro. It's there because Venezuela is the perfect staging ground for a broader strategy. Moscow wants to force the US to divide its attention and resources, stretching American military assets thin across multiple theaters. Every dollar spent countering Russian influence in the Caribbean is a dollar not spent in the Indo-Pacific, where China looms larger. And every time the US Navy shadows Russian warships near Venezuelan waters, it's a reminder that the post-Cold War unipolar moment is over. But Russia isn't the only player. China has been quietly embedding itself in Venezuela's military infrastructure for years. Since 2014, Beijing has sold Caracas over $600 million worth of military equipment, including radar systems, armored vehicles, and even drones. More importantly, China has helped Venezuela modernize its military communications, integrating Chinese-made satellite systems and cyber capabilities. In 2021, reports emerged that Venezuela was using Chinese technology to monitor and suppress dissent, a chilling precedent for how authoritarian regimes can leverage foreign military partnerships to entrench their power. Let me put this in perspective. During the Cold War, the US faced Soviet proxies in Cuba and Nicaragua, but those were contained by a combination of military deterrence and economic pressure. Today, the game has changed. Russia and China aren't just backing client states, they're building integrated military networks that could challenge US dominance in the region. And Venezuela is the linchpin. Now, why should Americans care? After all, Venezuela isn't Ukraine. It's not on the front lines of a global conflict. But that's exactly the path the US has spent the last 30 years fighting wars in the Middle East, assuming that the Western Hemisphere was secure. That assumption is no longer valid. If Russia and China can turn Venezuela into a forward operating base, they can threaten US interests in ways we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Consider the military implications. Venezuela's coastline stretches over 1,700 miles, giving it control over key maritime choke points like the Gulf of Venezuela and the Caribbean Sea. If Russia were to establish a permanent naval presence there, it could disrupt U.S. supply lines, monitor American submarine activity, and even threaten the AMA Canal, a critical artery for global trade. During the 2020 U.S. elections, there were reports that Russian intelligence operatives were using Venezuelan territory to interfere in American politics. That's not just a cyber threat. That's a national security crisis. And then there's the nuclear angle. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a memorandum of understanding to explore the use of nuclear energy for civilian purposes. On the surface, that's about power plants. But in reality, it's about laying the groundwork for future cooperation. If Venezuela were to develop a nuclear program, even a peaceful one, it would give Russia and China a foothold in the region's energy sector, further eroding U.S. influence. So what does this mean for U.S. policy? The establishment's reflex is to double down on military pressure, more sanctions, more naval patrols, more covert operations. But that's a losing strategy. The U.S. can't outspend Russia and China in Venezuela, and it can't afford to get bogged down in another endless conflict. What it can do is recognize that military power alone won't solve this problem. Here's what I propose. First, the U.S. needs to rethink its approach to deterrence. Instead of treating Venezuela as a rogue state to be contained, it should treat it as a sovereign nation with legitimate security concerns. That means engaging with Maduro's government not to endorse it, but to negotiate limits on foreign military presence. The U.S. could offer to lift certain sanctions in exchange for guarantees that Venezuela won't host Russian or Chinese military bases. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the new Cold War in America's backyard. Second, the U.S. needs to invest in regional alliances. The days of unilateral intervention are over. Instead, Washington should work with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to create a collective security framework that keeps foreign powers out of Latin America. That doesn't mean reviving the Monroe Doctrine. It means recognizing that the region's stability is in everyone's interest and that the U.S. can't go it alone. Third, the U.S. needs to compete economically. Russia and China are in Venezuela because they see an opportunity to exploit America's absence. The U.S. should counter that by offering better trade deals, more investment, and a clear alternative to dependence on Moscow and Beijing. That's how you win influence, not with bombs and sanctions, but with prosperity and partnership. Let me be, this isn't about appeasement. It's about realism. The U.S. can't afford to ignore Venezuela, but it also can't afford to turn it into another proxy war. The stakes are too high. If we get this wrong, we could wake up one day to find that the Caribbean is no longer an American lake. And by then, it will be too late to do anything about it. The Venezuela crisis is a warning. It's a sign that the global order is shifting, and that the U.S. can no longer take its dominance for granted. The question is whether we'll learn from it or whether we'll repeat the mistakes of the past. The choice is ours. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real turning point in Venezuela isn't happening in the halls of the Pentagon or the Kremlin, it's unfolding in the streets of Caracas, Maracaibo, and the barrios that have been ground zero for 2 decades of political and economic collapse. The domestic dimension of this crisis is where the geopolitical chessboard meets the raw, unpredictable force of human desperation. And if we ignore it, we do so at our peril. Let me explain why this matters. The Maduro government isn't just a regime propped up by Russian mercenaries and Chinese loans, it's a political machine that has survived hyperinflation, mass emigration, and a failed coup attempt in 2019 because it has mastered the art of survival in a country where the state has become both predator and provider. The numbers tell a brutal story. Since 2013, Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75%, according to the IMF. The bolivar has lost 99.999% of its value against the dollar since 2018. And yet, Maduro remains in power. How? Because in a collapsed economy, the state's ability to distribute food, medicine, and gasoline, no matter how sporadically, becomes the only lifeline for millions. The local Committees for Supply and Production, a government food distribution program, reaches about 6 million households. That's not charity, it's control. And it's why, despite everything, Maduro still commands a base of support that no opposition leader has been able to break. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's opposition, for all its moral clarity, has failed to offer a viable alternative. Juan Guaido's 2019 self-declaration as interim president was a bold gamble, but it was also a gamble that depended on two things: U.S. backing and a military defection that never materialized. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which included crippling oil sanctions and a failed coup attempt in April 2019, was supposed to force Maduro out. Instead, it strengthened his grip. The sanctions didn't just hurt the regime, they accelerated the collapse of what was left of Venezuela's economy, pushing another 5 million people into exile. And when the military didn't turn on Maduro, Guaido's movement lost its momentum. By 2021, even the U.S. had quietly downgraded its support, and today, Guaido is a figurehead without a country. But the opposition's problems run deeper than failed strategies. Venezuela's political class is fractured, and its leaders are often as distrusted as the government they oppose. Enrique Capriles, who nearly defeated Maduro in the 2013 election, has been sidelined. Leopoldo López, once the face of the opposition, is in exile. And the younger generation of leaders, like Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition's primary in 2023 with over 90% of the vote, are either barred from running or face constant harassment. The regime has perfected the art of divide and rule, using legal maneuvers, arbitrary arrests, and co-optation to keep its opponents weak. And it's working. In the 2024 presidential election, Maduro ran against a hand-picked opposition candidate, Edmundo González, who was only allowed to participate after the regime disqualified Machado and other front-runners. The result? A sham election that even Venezuela's allies in China and Russia struggled to endorse. So where does that leave us? The most likely scenario, in my view, is neither collapse nor democratization, but a prolonged, unstable equilibrium, a kind of frozen conflict where Maduro remains in power, but the country remains ungovernable. The regime has shown it can survive sanctions, protests, and even coup attempts, but it can't fix the economy. Oil production, which once accounted for 95% of Venezuela's export revenue, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The state-owned oil company, PDVSA, is a shell of its former self, riddled with corruption and mismanagement. And without oil revenue, the government can't fund its patronage networks, which means its grip on power will only weaken over time. But here's the: Maduro doesn't need to fix the economy to stay in power. He just needs to keep enough of the military and the security forces loyal, and he's done that by giving them control over key sectors: oil smuggling, gold mining, and the drug trade. The Cartel of the Suns, a network of military officers and officials involved in cocaine trafficking, has turned Venezuela into a major transit hub for drugs bound for the US and Europe. The DEA estimates that as much as 250 metric tons of cocaine pass through Venezuela each year. That's not just a criminal enterprise, it's a parallel economy that keeps the generals happy and the regime afloat. The other scenario, of course, is that Maduro is eventually forced out, not by the opposition, but by a split within the military. That's what happened in 1958, when the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez collapsed after the armed forces withdrew their support. But there's a key difference: the military isn't just a political actor, it's an economic one. The generals aren't just loyal to Maduro because of ideology, they're loyal because they're profiting from the status quo. And as long as that's the case, the chances of a military coup are slim. So what does this mean for the geopolitical picture I laid out earlier? It means that any U.S. strategy that ignores the domestic realities of Venezuela is doomed to fail. You can't negotiate with Maduro as if he's just another autocrat who can be pressured into concessions. He's a survivor, and he's playing a long game. The same goes for the opposition. If the U.S. wants to counter Russian and Chinese influence, it needs to do more than just lift sanctions or offer investment. It needs to help build a credible alternative to Maduro, one that can win the trust of the Venezuelan people and, crucially, the military. That's easier said than done. The opposition's divisions run deep, and the regime's repression makes organizing nearly impossible. But there are signs of hope. The 2023 primary, which Machado won in a landslide, showed that there's still a hunger for change. And the fact that Maduro felt the need to rig the 2024 election, rather than cancel it outright, suggests that he's not as confident as he once was. The key, in my view, is to focus on the local level. The opposition has made gains in municipal and state elections, and that's where the real power lies. If the US and its allies can support grassroots organizing, independent media, and local governance, they can start to chip away at the regime's control. But this isn't a short-term project. Venezuela's crisis has been decades in the making, and it won't be resolved overnight. The question is whether the US and the international community have the patience and the strategic vision to play the long game. Because if they don't, the alternative isn't just a failed state on America's doorstep, it's a failed state that's increasingly beholden to Russia and China. And that's a scenario no one should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US has already tried nearly every conceivable approach to Venezuela, short of full-scale invasion, and none of them have worked. The Obama administration's cautious engagement in 2014, the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign with sanctions and the recognition of Juan Guaido in 2019, and now the Biden team's reluctant, transactional diplomacy, all have failed to dislodge Maduro. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps defaulting to the same sanctions, moral condemnation, and the occasional half-hearted negotiation. It's as if they're stuck in a loop, unable to accept that the old tools of statecraft simply don't apply in a country where the state itself is a hollowed-out shell, propped up by criminal networks and foreign patrons. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Venezuela as a problem to be managed, not a country to be understood. The result? A policy that oscillates between indifference and overreach, with little in between. When Obama sent diplomats to Caracas in 2014, it was seen as a bold move until Maduro used the opening to consolidate power and jail opposition leaders. When Trump imposed sanctions, the regime didn't collapse, it just pivoted to gold smuggling, cryptocurrency, and deeper ties with Iran and Russia. And now, with Biden's team quietly easing some sanctions in exchange for electoral promises Maduro has no intention of keeping, we're back to square a regime that survives by playing the US against itself. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy challenge. It's a test of whether the US can adapt to a world where power is no longer measured in aircraft carriers and trade deals, but in the ability to shape narratives, control supply chains, and exploit institutional decay. Russia and China understand this. That's why they've embedded themselves in Venezuela's economy not through grand treaties, but through opaque contracts, debt for equity swaps, and the kind of backroom deals that don't show up on balance sheets. The Russian oil giant Rosneft didn't just buy Venezuelan crude, it helped the regime evade sanctions by creating shadow shipping networks. China didn't just lend money, it took control of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, ensuring that even if Maduro falls, Beijing will still have a claim on the country's most valuable resource. So what's the alternative? If the US wants to counter this, it needs a strategy that's as nimble and ruthless as the one Maduro has used to stay in power. That means 3 things. First, stop treating Venezuela as a monolith. The country is a patchwork of local power centers, military commanders, gang leaders, and regional elites, each with their own interests. The US should be engaging with these actors, not just the opposition in exile. Second, sanctions need to be smarter. Right now, they're a blunt instrument that hurts ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. Instead of broad economic restrictions, the US should target the specific networks that keep Maduro: the gold smugglers, the cryptocurrency launderers, the Russian and Iranian middlemen. And third, the US needs to offer a real economic alternative. That doesn't mean lifting sanctions and hoping for the best, it means working with allies to create a post-Maduro reconstruction plan that includes debt relief, investment guarantees, and a clear path to reintegrating Venezuela into the global economy. But none of this will work if the US keeps treating Venezuela as a sideshow. The country is at the center of a geopolitical storm, and the longer the status quo persists, the harder it will be to reverse. The 2024 election was a wake-up call. Maduro didn't just steal the vote, he exposed the limits of US influence. The opposition's best chance now isn't another round of negotiations or more sanctions. It's building a parallel state, one that can deliver services, security, and hope to a population that's been abandoned by its own government. That's a long-term project, but it's the only one that stands a chance. I've spent years studying failed states, and Venezuela is a case study in how quickly a country can unravel when the institutions that hold it together collapse. But it's also a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a path forward if you're willing to take it. The question is whether the US and its allies have the stomach for the kind of patient, creative statecraft that's required. Because if they don't, Venezuela won't just be a problem for the next administration. It'll be a crisis that defines the next decade of Latin American and global geopolitics. And by then, it may be too late to do anything about it.